The moment David found the text messages, his whole world shifted. It wasn't a gradual realization, it wasn't something he could have prepared for. It hit with the force of a wrecking ball, shattering every assumption he had about the life he thought he was living. The phone in his hand wasn't even hers, it was a shared family tablet that she, apparently, thought he'd never check. But there it was, glaring at him in the dim glow of their bedroom, a series of messages between his wife Lauren and a man named Greg. Messages that left no ambiguity about what they were doing and how long it had been going on. David's hands trembled as he scrolled through the thread. 4 years. 4 damn years. Lauren had been meeting Greg in hotels, during her conference trips, and even sneaking him into their home when David was out of town for work. The words burned into his brain, explicit, vile, and dripping with betrayal. She hadn't just fallen into this, she had orchestrated it. She had lied, planned, and built an entire second life while sitting across from him at breakfast every morning, pretending she loved him. For a man who prided himself on being observant, David couldn't believe how blind he'd been. The signs were all there in hindsight: the sudden gym obsession, the new wardrobe, the way she had pulled back from him emotionally. But he'd always chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of a marriage. They'd been together for 12 years, and he thought things were just going through a rough patch. He didn't realize that rough patch was her stepping out on him regularly with some guy who wasn't even good-looking, judging by the photos she had saved. As the clock ticked past midnight, David realized he was oddly calm. The initial wave of anger had passed, leaving behind a cold, calculating clarity. His marriage was over, that much was certain, but Lauren wouldn't get to walk away unscathed. She had been building her double life for years, and David decided he'd spend 1 week tearing it all down. Over the next few hours, David formulated a plan. He wasn't going to confront her right away, no. That would give her time to cover her tracks, to manipulate the narrative with her usual charm. Instead, he would document every piece of evidence he could find, ensuring that when the time came, she'd have no way to spin the story. By dawn, David had combed through her emails, her social media, and every hidden folder on her devices. He wasn't hacking anything, she had been careless enough to leave her passwords saved on the family computer. He found receipts for hotel stays, photos of her with Greg, and even a few poorly written love letters she had saved in a draft folder. It was disgusting, but it was also enough to build an airtight case. Lauren walked into the kitchen that morning, still in her robe, smiling at him like nothing had changed. David forced himself to smile back, though it took everything in him not to snap right then and there. "Morning," she said, kissing his cheek. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," David replied, keeping his tone even. "Want me to make you some coffee?" "No, I've got it," he said, turning away to hide the fury that was undoubtedly flashing across his face. As she moved about the kitchen, humming to herself, David realized just how much she disgusted him now. Every word out of her mouth felt like a lie, every gesture an insult. But he swallowed it down. There was no room for emotion yet. Over the next few days, David continued his quiet investigation. He reached out to a divorce attorney to understand his options and ensure he wouldn't make any missteps. He learned that, in their state, infidelity could play a significant role in the division of assets and custody arrangements. That information fueled him further. Lauren, oblivious to his discovery, went about her usual routine. She even mentioned another work trip coming up that weekend. David asked casual questions, knowing full well she'd be meeting Greg. She lied effortlessly, as if she were discussing the weather. By Friday, everything was in place. David had all the proof he needed, and the divorce papers were ready to be filed first thing Monday morning. He had also made arrangements to change the locks, cancel her access to their joint accounts, and notify her employer, who, as it turned out, had strict policies against workplace affairs. Greg worked there too, which made it all the sweeter. On Saturday morning, David pretended to head out to the hardware store, but instead parked down the street, waiting for Greg to show up. Sure enough, an unfamiliar car pulled into their driveway an hour later. David watched as Lauren let Greg in, laughing and kissing him like they were in some trashy rom-com. He gave them a full hour before walking back into his house, slamming the door loudly to ensure they'd hear him. "Lauren," he called out, keeping his tone calm but firm. "You might want to come downstairs." The color drained from her face as she appeared at the top of the stairs, Greg trailing behind her like a guilty teenager. "David, what are you doing here?" she stammered. "I live here," he said coldly. "And you're about to explain what this guy is doing in my house." Greg tried to say something, but David cut him off with a glare so sharp it could have cut glass. "You don't get to speak," David snapped. "This is between me and my wife." Lauren's excuses started pouring out in a panicked rush, how it wasn't what it looked like, how she could explain everything, how she still loved him. David laughed bitterly. "You've been screwing him for 4 years, Lauren. Do you really expect me to believe a word out of your mouth right now?" The confrontation was brutal, every word laced with years of pent-up anger and betrayal. Lauren cried, begged for forgiveness, and tried to spin it as a mistake, but David wasn't having it. "This wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. This was you lying to my face every single day for years. You don't get to call it a mistake just because you got caught." By the time David finished tearing into her, Lauren was a sobbing mess. Greg had slunk out the door halfway through, clearly realizing he was out of his depth. David took one last look at her before grabbing his pre-packed bag and heading for the door. "You can stay here tonight, but don't get comfortable," he said coldly. "By Monday, you're out of this house, and don't even think about touching the bank accounts. I've already taken care of that." As he drove away, David felt an odd sense of relief. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. Lauren had destroyed their marriage, but he would make damn sure she didn't walk away unscathed. By Sunday afternoon, the reality of her situation seemed to hit Lauren like a freight train. David had stayed at a hotel the night before, leaving her in the hollow shell of what used to be their home. The locks hadn't been changed yet, but the weight of his words from the day before hung over her like a storm cloud. She had tried calling him twice, but both calls went straight to voicemail. When he didn't respond to her texts either, she realized that the situation was far worse than she'd initially thought. David wasn't just angry, he was done. She spent most of the day pacing the living room, alternating between bursts of frantic energy and moments of stunned silence. The house felt eerie without David's presence, as if all the warmth and familiarity had been sucked out of it overnight. She couldn't deny what she had done, but she also couldn't fathom how utterly ruthlessly David had confronted her. This wasn't the man who forgave her for snapping at him during arguments, or the man who bent over backward to make her happy, even when she didn't deserve it. This was someone she didn't recognize, and it terrified her. By early evening, a knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. She rushed to answer, half hoping it was David, but instead, she found Greg standing there with a sheepish, almost boyish grin on his face. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, glancing over her shoulder, as if David might appear out of thin air. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," Greg said, stepping inside uninvited. Lauren closed the door behind him, her frustration mounting. "You shouldn't be here. If David finds out..." Greg interrupted, placing a hand on her arm. "He already knows. What difference does it make now?" She pulled her arm free, glaring at him. "You don't understand. He's not just angry, he's calculated. He has everything: emails, messages, photos. He's going to bury me, Greg." Greg shrugged, clearly trying to downplay the situation. "Look, he's mad right now, but he'll cool off. Guys like him, they don't know how to stick to being angry. He'll cave." Lauren shook her head, her voice trembling. "You didn't see him. He's not caving." Greg sighed and sat down on the couch, looking far too relaxed for Lauren's liking. "So what do you want to do? Run off together? Start fresh?" The sheer audacity of his suggestion made her stomach turn. She stared at him, incredulous. "Run off together? Are you serious right now? Do you even have a plan? A job? Anything?" Greg's expression hardened. "What? Because I'm not a corporate drone like him, I'm not good enough for you?" "This isn't about being good enough," Lauren snapped, her voice rising. "This is about the fact that my entire life is crumbling around me, and you're sitting here acting like this is some kind of romantic getaway." Greg stood up, his demeanor shifting from defensive to confrontational. "You know what, Lauren? Maybe I made a mistake too. You're acting like he's the victim here. but let's not pretend you didn't have your reasons for seeking me out in the first place. Get out, Lauren said through gritted teeth, pointing to the door. Greg hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were about to argue, but something in her glare made him think twice. Without another word, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. Lauren stood there for a moment, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. The silence that followed was deafening. On Monday morning, David returned to the house not to talk, but to make good on his word. Lauren heard the sound of the locks being changed before she saw him, and when she opened the door, she found him standing on the porch with a locksmith. He didn't even look at her. "David, can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaky. "You'll have plenty of time to talk in court," he replied coolly, signing off on the locksmith's paperwork. "Court," she echoed, her stomach dropping. David finally turned to face her, his expression as cold and unyielding as stone. "You think I was bluffing? The divorce papers are being filed today. You'll be served by the end of the week." Lauren's eyes filled with tears. "David, please. I made a mistake, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling." "Stop," David interrupted, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "Just stop. You don't get to play the save our marriage card now, not after everything you've done. Counseling isn't going to fix this, Lauren. Nothing is." She reached for him, but he stepped back, the cold distance between them palpable. "You can't just throw away 12 years like this," she whispered. "You threw it away the moment you let him into our bed," David shot back, his voice laced with venom. "Don't pin this on me." Lauren broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably, but David didn't falter. He handed her a folder containing copies of the evidence he had gathered, along with a list of the next steps she'd need to take to vacate the house. "I've already spoken to the bank," he said. "Your name is off the joint accounts. You'll have access to your personal savings, but that's it. I'm not letting you drain me dry on your way out." "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David shrugged, his indifference cutting deeper than any words could. "That's not my problem." He left without another word, leaving Lauren to collapse onto the couch, clutching the folder as if it were a lifeline. By the end of the week, the divorce papers arrived, just as David had promised. Lauren tried calling him again, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but he never responded. It wasn't until she showed up at his office unannounced that she finally got to speak to him again. "You're not supposed to be here," he said the moment he saw her standing in the lobby. "David, please," she begged. "Just hear me out." "You've had 12 years to talk to me," Lauren, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm done listening." As security escorted her out of the building, Lauren realized this wasn't just anger. This was finality. David wasn't just walking away, he was erasing her from his life entirely. And for the first time, she understood what she had truly lost. Lauren sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room at her sister's house, staring blankly at the divorce papers spread out in front of her. It had been 3 weeks since David walked out of her life, and in that time, he hadn't shown a single crack in his resolve. Every attempt she made to contact him had been met with silence. Her once meticulously organized life had unraveled completely. Her home, her marriage, and even her dignity were gone. The knock on the bedroom door startled her. "Lauren?" "It's me," her sister Megan called softly. "Come in," Lauren said, her voice hoarse from crying. Megan stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. She crossed her arms, her expression a mix of pity and frustration. "You've been in here all morning. You need to eat something." "I'm not hungry," Lauren mumbled, running her fingers over the embossed seal on the papers. The weight of the legal document felt crushing. Megan sighed, sitting down beside her. "What's the plan here? You can't just sit around waiting for him to change his mind." Lauren looked at her helplessly. "What am I supposed to do, Megan? He hates me. He won't even look at me." "Can you blame him?" Megan's tone was sharper than Lauren expected. "You lied to him for years, Lauren. You didn't just wreck the marriage, you blew it to pieces." "I didn't plan for this to happen," Lauren said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know why I did it." Megan raised an eyebrow. "You don't know? Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you got bored and decided to ruin your own life." Lauren's mouth opened, but no words came out. Megan wasn't wrong. and the truth of it stung. She felt tears welling up again, but before she could cry, Megan grabbed her hand. "Listen," Megan said, her tone softening. "You need to stop wallowing and start figuring out what's next. David isn't coming back. He's done, Lauren. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can move forward." Lauren nodded weakly, but the idea of moving forward felt impossible. Her mind was stuck in a loop, replaying the look on David's face when he had confronted her. The cold fury in his eyes had been worse than any shouting match. He hadn't just been angry, he had been disgusted. Meanwhile, David was thriving. If Lauren had expected him to fall apart after the divorce papers were filed, she couldn't have been more wrong. He had thrown himself into his work, taking on new projects that kept him busy and distracted. His colleagues noticed the change. He was sharper, more focused, and more determined than ever. At home, he had made some changes. The house, once filled with Lauren's touches, her throw pillows, her carefully curated artwork, was now stripped back to the basics. It was cleaner, quieter, and undeniably his. The emptiness felt liberating rather than lonely. On a Tuesday afternoon, David's lawyer called with an update. "Lauren's attorney has sent over a counterproposal," the lawyer said. "She's requesting spousal support." David laughed bitterly. "Spousal support? After what she did?" The lawyer sighed. "It's pretty standard for cases like this, but given the evidence we've submitted, I doubt a judge would award her much, if anything." "Good," David said firmly. "I'm not giving her a cent more than she's entitled to." The next day, David found himself at a coffee shop, meeting with a real estate agent to discuss selling the house. As much as he loved the place, it was too big for one person, and he wanted a fresh start somewhere new. The agent was showing him listings when a familiar voice interrupted. "David." He looked up and saw Lauren standing a few feet away, clutching a to-go cup. She looked tired and thinner than he remembered. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of something pity. Maybe, but he quickly pushed it aside. "What do you want, Lauren?" he asked, his tone cold. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said awkwardly. "Can we talk?" "I'm busy," he said, gesturing to the agent. "And I don't see what's left to talk about." "Please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Just 5 minutes." David sighed, closing the folder in front of him. "Fine." They stepped outside, and Lauren immediately started apologizing. "I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry for everything. I never wanted to hurt you." "And yet you did," he said flatly, over and over again. She flinched at his words, tears pooling in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to at least try to understand." "Understand," David interrupted, his voice rising. "You want me to understand why you cheated on me for 4 years? Why you lied to my face every single day? There's nothing to understand, Lauren. You were selfish. End of story." "I was unhappy," she blurted, her voice desperate. "I felt invisible, David. You were always working, always distracted. I needed someone who made me feel alive." David stared at her, his expression icy. "So instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you decided to betray me? You think that justifies what you did?" "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It doesn't. I know it doesn't." He shook his head, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You don't get it, do you? I wasn't perfect, Lauren, but I was loyal. I gave you everything I had, and it still wasn't enough for you. You threw away 12 years for what? Some cheap thrill? Someone who didn't even stick around when things got hard." Lauren sobbed, unable to respond. David took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm done, Lauren," he said quietly. "I've moved on. You should too." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, broken and alone. 2 months later, the divorce was finalized. David got the house, along with the satisfaction of knowing Lauren didn't get a dime in spousal support. He sold the property shortly after and moved into a sleek, modern condo in the city, a space that felt like a true fresh start. As he unpacked the last of his boxes, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Lauren's betrayal had been devastating, but it hadn't destroyed him. If anything, it had made him stronger. He was free now, free to rebuild his life on his terms. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. David stood in the lobby of his new condo building, flipping through his mail. Most of it was junk, but one envelope caught his attention. It was addressed to him in handwriting he recognized all too well. Lauren. He sighed, debating whether to toss it in the trash, but curiosity got the better of him. Tearing it open, he found a handwritten letter. Her words were long, rambling, and full of regret. David. I don't know if you'll even read this, but I needed to try. I've lost everything, and I know it's my fault. I've been replaying everything in my mind, and I can't believe how much I hurt you. If I could take it all back, I would. I know you've moved on, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm trying to make things right with myself. I was selfish, and I see that now. I hope someday you'll remember the good times we had, and not just the way it ended. Lauren. David read the letter twice before folding it neatly and shoving it into his pocket. He felt nothing, no anger, no sadness, no pity. Just nothing. Whatever bond he once shared with Lauren had been severed completely. He didn't regret his decision to cut her out of his life, and her words did nothing to change that. As he stepped into the elevator, his phone buzzed with a text from his coworker Liz. They'd been working closely on a major project, and their casual conversations had started to stray beyond work. She was funny, sharp, and refreshingly straightforward. Unlike Lauren, she didn't dance around her intentions or play games. Liz said, "Hey, do you want to grab dinner tonight? No work talk, I promise." David smiled to himself. Liz was the kind of person who didn't hesitate to take initiative, and he appreciated that. He typed back quickly. David said, "Sounds good. 7?" Liz said, "Perfect. I'll pick the place." Later that evening, David walked into a cozy Italian restaurant Liz had chosen. She was already there, seated at a small table near the window, her dark hair pulled back and a confident smile on her face. She waved him over, and he felt an unexpected sense of ease as he sat down. "You're early," he said, smirking. "I like to scope out the menu first," she replied. "But I already know I'm getting the ravioli." David chuckled, appreciating the casual banter. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on everything from work to hobbies to embarrassing childhood stories. For the first time in months, David wasn't thinking about Lauren or the divorce or the betrayal that had derailed his life. He was just enjoying the moment. As the night went on, Liz leaned in slightly, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "You know, I've been meaning to ask you something." David raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Why haven't you dated anyone since the divorce? You're a great guy. Smart, funny. Devastatingly handsome," she teased, her eyes sparkling. David laughed, but the question caught him off guard. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I guess I just needed time to figure things out. I didn't want to rush into anything." Liz nodded, her gaze softening. "That makes sense. But for what it's worth, I think you've got a lot to offer, and whoever gets to be with you next is lucky." Her words lingered in the air, and David felt a warmth he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the possibility of happiness wasn't so far out of reach. Meanwhile, Lauren was unraveling. Her sister Megan had been patient, but even she was starting to lose sympathy. Lauren's endless cycle of self-pity and regret had worn thin. One evening, Megan decided to confront her. "You need to get a grip," Megan said bluntly, crossing her arms. "David's gone, and he's not coming back. Sitting around feeling sorry for yourself isn't going to change that." Lauren bristled. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't regret everything I've done?" "Regret isn't enough," Megan shot back. "You need to actually do something with your life. Get a job. Find a place to live. Stop waiting for him to magically forgive you." Lauren's cheeks flushed with anger, but she knew Megan was right. She had been wallowing for weeks, hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. She needed to take control of her life, but the idea of starting over felt insurmountable. That night, Lauren decided to reach out to Greg. She hadn't spoken to him since their last argument, but she didn't know who else to turn to. She called him, and to her surprise, he answered. Lauren, Greg said, his tone wary. What do you want? I need to talk, she said. Can we meet? Greg sighed. Fine. Tomorrow, same coffee shop as before. The next day, Lauren sat across from Greg, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. He looked tired and irritated, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. What's this about? Greg asked, leaning back in his chair. Lauren hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't know what to do, Greg. My life is falling apart, and I feel like I've lost everything. Greg scoffed. You think your life's hard? I lost my job because of you. Lauren's eyes widened. What? How? Your husband, Greg said bitterly. He went to HR and reported the affair. They fired me for violating the company's ethics policy. Lauren felt a pang of guilt, but Greg's tone quickly turned accusatory. You ruined my life too, Lauren. And for what? You're not worth it. The words hit her like a slap. Any lingering hope she had of rekindling something with Greg evaporated in that moment. She realized he didn't care about her, he never had. She had risked everything for a man who saw her as nothing more than a fleeting distraction. Lauren stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You're right, she said, her voice shaky. I'm not worth it. But neither are you. She walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Greg sitting there, stunned. For the first time, Lauren felt the faintest glimmer of resolve. She didn't know what her future held, but she knew it wouldn't involve Greg or David or anyone else. She was on her own now, and it was time to face that reality. Back at his condo, David was cleaning up after dinner when his phone buzzed. It was Liz, sending him a photo of a dog she'd seen at an adoption event. The caption read, "You need one of these. Trust me." David chuckled, texting back, "Only if you help me pick one out." Liz said, "Deal. Tomorrow." David paused, a smile tugging at his lips. Tomorrow sounded good.